If you were in Sarajevo a little more than 111 years ago, you might have seen a strange procession that made its way to the courthouse each day. At the centre of it, a small man with dark hair and pale features shuffled along, bound in chains. He didn't look particularly impressive, but Gavrilo Princip had fired a shot that was heard around the world. After which, the danger of war was all anybody could talk about. The assassin's goal had been to force Austria-Hungary to give up Bosnia, but the situation had spiraled out of anybody's control. It dragged in all of the great powers. Even Britain agreed to enter the war, should there be a substantial violation of Belgian neutrality, if only by a single vote in cabinet. The Germans marched into Belgium, so on August the 4th, 1914, Britain declared war, splitting cabinet. 6 ministers resigned. Charles Trevelyan declared in his resignation letter that the struggle between Serbia and Austria-Hungary was not worth the life of a single British soldier. Not that Britain had that many to spare, compared to either of those countries. The British Expeditionary Force wasn't just small by the standards of a great power. At only 160,000 men, the BEF was about the same size as the army of Serbia. The Kaiser described it as a contemptible little army. He and the other great powers used conscription to field armies almost an order of magnitude larger, but it was the only professional army in Europe. As the 800,000 Germans pressed forward into Belgium, driven by the implacable timetable of the Schlieffen Plan, General Wilson set his own plans in motion. He had been working on them since 1911. He wanted the British army to assist the French, rather than the Belgians, that they had gone to war to protect. So it was that on the border of Belgium and France that the British Expeditionary Force fired its first shots. On the morning of the 22nd, cavalry from a squadron of the 4th Royal Irish Dragoon Guards deployed at the top of a gentle slope, about 3 miles north of the Mons Candide Canal. There was a troop of Uhlans coming down the road towards them. Some could see the officer in front smoking his cigar. He signalled for his troop to stop. He looked around, and then the Germans galloped back down the road, with the British in hot pursuit. The first troop got stuck in with their swords. The 4th troop dismounted, found cover for their horses by the side of a chateau wall. Sergeant Thomas was one of them. He had been born into the army, his father serving in the Durham Light Infantry. He joined up at 14 in India. And by the time the First World War broke out, he had already been serving for 15 years. He spotted a German cavalry officer 400 yards away, and then squeezed the trigger of his rifle. After years on the ranges shooting at paper targets, he was amazed to see the man fall. This was the first German to fall to a British bullet on the Western Front. His officer, Captain Hornby, had also taken down one of the enemy with his sword. He was awarded a DSO by their brigadier, who had promised one for the first person to kill a German with the new patent cavalry sabre. They also took 5 prisoners, with no casualties on their side. But these were not the first enemy killed by the British Army in the First World War. That happened thousands of miles to the south and on a different continent. By the time that the troops of the British Expeditionary Force first made contact with the enemy near Mons, the first British campaign was already reaching its conclusion. This was the British invasion of the German colony of Togoland. One of the first actions by the British had been to cut the German telegraph lines, but the Germans were expecting this. The Germans based their communications around wireless because, as Admiral Fisher had said in 1912, you cannot cut the air. Wireless also suited their more flexible, decentralized style of command and control. Each of the 7 German armies deployed to the Western Front was equipped with a 2 kilowatt Telefunken set that had a range between 150 and 180 miles. They had fixed wireless stations with even longer range. As long as they kept this network together, they would be able to keep in contact with their colonies. The reason behind the invasion of Togoland was to break this network. On the 12th of August 1914, the British were advancing towards the vital wireless station at Kamina. The Germans knew about them and had sent out a party to blow up a railway line in order to slow them down. Regimental Sergeant Major Alhaji Grunchi of the Gold Coast Regiment spotted a German soldier and opened fire. This was the first shot by the British Army in World War I. When the Germans failed to stop the British advance, they destroyed the wireless station themselves before surrendering on the 26th of August, just 4 days after the skirmish in Europe near Mons Canal. Interestingly, Africa was also the location for the last shot fired by the Germans against the British Army during the First World War. This was when a German Askaris ambushed a lone motorcyclist on November the 12th, 1918. They only found out about the armistice when they searched through the papers that he was carrying, as they included reports on the previous day's European ceasefire. Togoland was the location for the first shot of the British Army during the First World War, but it was not the first British shot of the war. The day after Britain's declaration of war, a German ship was steaming along the Thames estuary. At first glance, you might have thought that this was an excursion steamer that had found itself at the wrong place at the wrong time. But if you look closer, you would have seen splashes as the crew pushed something off the deck. If you focused a telescope on it, you might be able to tell what these things were. Sea mines. It was laying a minefield. This was something that Commodore Truitt considered extremely unsporting, as it would take months before they could make the North Sea safe for yachting again. Germany did not have many specialist mine layers. Before the war, this one had been an excursion steamer that had been owned by the Hamburg America Line. It had been used to take tourists from Hamburg to Heligoland. When the Kaiserliche Marine pressed her into service, they'd taken on the crew as well, as their contracts required voluntary service in the Navy should war break out. So they went from dealing with tourists to an even less predictable type of passenger in the shape of a sea mine, but at least now they were allowed to throw these ones over the side. Mines predated the Great War by a long way. The first use of something like a mine was probably all the way back in 1585, when explosives were floated down the River Scheldt to blow up the bridge that the Spanish had constructed to block Antwerp from the sea. The next innovation came in 1775, when David Bushell of Connecticut demonstrated that it was possible to explode a gunpowder charge underwater. He then developed what was nicknamed the Bushell keg. This was made of a 35 or 70 kilogram explosive contained in a watertight barrel. Samuel Colt, the famous gunmaker and fellow Connecticut resident, also experimented with sea mines. In 1842, he adopted an electrical firing device so that his mines could be moored in place and then fired from a distance. It was not until the Civil War broke out that mines were seriously and effectively employed. But at the time, they were called torpedoes, which we now think of something completely different. When Rear Admiral David Fogert said "damn the torpedoes" as he led his squadron into Mobile Bay, he was actually talking about the minefield that the Confederates had laid. The Confederates laid a lot of mines because the southern states had a huge coastline and no navy to speak of. By the end of the war, 29 Federal vessels had been sunk by them, and 14 more suffered major damage. But sinking ships is not the most important thing about mine warfare. Minefields are very good at keeping fleets out of an area of the sea. Even decoy mines can be very useful at stopping the enemy fleet from sailing wherever it wanted. The problem is that they continue to operate even after the war has ended. Between 500 and 600 peaceful Chinese sailors died after finding themselves in a leftover minefields from the Russo-Japanese War. The Chinese issued an impassioned appeal to the world to regulate the use of sea mines, which resulted in Hague Convention 8. Only 7 years later, this convention would face its first test. As early as the 11th of August 1914, Great Britain advised the United States that the Germans were scattering mines indiscriminately about the North Sea, and that it reserved the right to do likewise. Great Britain declared that the entire North Sea was a military area, which neutral ships would enter at their own risks. The Germans declared the waters around the British Isles a military area in response. France and Great Britain set minefields all across the Heligoland Bight, Although at this stage in the war they turned out to be useless. The Germans just swept channels through the minefields and left the rest in place to form part of their own defences. It wasn't until 1917 that the British would get a truly effective sea mine after they copied a German design, which allowed them to finally complete their lines of barrages across the North Sea. However, as the König Louise crept towards the Thames estuary on August the 4th, that was still all in the future. She had been repainted to look like the Hook of Holland ferry that ran by the Great Eastern Railway Company. This disguise did not give her much protection, considering how different the two vessels looked. She had already been at sea when the declaration of war was made, and received her orders by wireless. She entered the Thames estuary from the north, targeting the King's Channel slightly to the southeast of Harwich on the Essex coast. Once she got in position, she started to lay the mines in the channel in the hope of cutting off London, then the Empire's greatest port. At 10:40, she was spotted by the destroyers HMS Landrail and HMS Lance. They'd been told about a suspicious ship throwing things overboard by a trawler. As the destroyers raced towards her, the König Louise accelerated to 21 knots and then turned back, hoping to lead the British ships into the minefield that she had just laid. The first shot came from HMS Lance at 10:45. Knowing that they had seen through her disguise, the German mine layer hoisted her German colours and then opened fire with everything that she had. It wasn't much. 8.8 centimetre guns had been set aside for her, but they were in such a rush converting her they'd not had time to fit them. This meant she only had two 3.7 centimetre heavy machine guns. The destroyers were far beyond their range, but this did not stop the Germans from trying. They even brought up rifles and pistols on deck to shoot at the British warships, but it was no use, and the order was given to scuttle the ship. Shortly after 12:20, she sank with her colours still flying, and the destroyers swept in to pick up the survivors. They were transferred to HMS Amphion, the cruiser leading the destroyer flotilla, before they continued on with their patrol. The flotilla returned to port the next stage, but Amphion was not with them. At 6:30 in the morning she had struck a mine, possibly one of those that had been laid the day before. It broke her back, and they began to evacuate. But then she struck a second mine. There was a massive explosion. Debris was flown far and wide, damaging the nearby rescue boats. One British officer and 150 sailors and some of the German prisoners died as she sank. The survivors were taken to Shotley. The captain and his first officer were questioned a few days later on the 10th of August by Naval Intelligence. How much of the minefield König Louise managed to lay was not known, but when the German ambassador left Britain, Admiral Keyes ordered his ship to manoeuvre as if it was passing through the intricate channels of a minefield to make them think that her mission had been a success. However, there was a much greater danger waiting for them, as the German ambassador insisted on flying a large German flag. Some destroyers from the Harwich flotilla spotted this. They charged at them, hoping to avenge the Amphion. Another ship, HMS Fox, had to protect the diplomats, who quickly dropped the offending flag. Even this might not have been the first British engagement during the war, only the first shots that were fired. A mere 5 minutes after Britain's ultimatum expired on August the 4th, a German bark, the Roland, was taken by British light cruiser off the Scilly Isles. The Great War was now in progress, and it would be 4 years until the guns fell silent again across Western Europe. The fighting went on in the east for even longer as the Great War transformed into the Russian Civil War. But next week I'm going to talk about the Navy's plan to go on the offensive against the German destroyers that were patrolling Heligoland, and what would become known as the Battle of Heligoland Bight. Thank you for listening for this long, and if that sounds interesting to you, please like and subscribe so there's a chance that the algorithm might let you see it.